Hi everybody, my name is Elizabeth and I'm a librarian here at the LSC Tomball Community Library. Welcome back to Screenshots, which is the series where I recommend to you great movies that you can watch for free with your library card. It's hard to imagine any writer who has had as great of an impact as William Shakespeare. If you went to school in English, there's a really good chance you did not get through school without having to read at least one of his plays, and they're still performed frequently today, nearly 500 years after he was alive. While Shakespeare wrote his plays to be performed on a stage, they've been a favorite for film adaptations basically for as long as film has existed. The very first Shakespeare adaptation on film was Taming of the Shrew, which was released in 1929, not long after motion pictures were first starting to be shown to commercial audiences. Ever since then, Shakespeare has been adapted in any number of ingenious ways for film. And so, since April is the month when we celebrate Shakespeare's birth, which was sometime around the 23rd of April, 1564, if you were wondering, today we are going to talk about 4 of my very favorite Shakespeare adaptations on film that you can watch for free with your library card. So, let's get started. When people think of Shakespeare, they tend to think epic narratives. They often tend to be historical or medieval in setting, with lots of politics and conniving and murder. And while that might be true for some of his work, a lot of the Bard's work is much smaller in scale and much more approachable in subject matter. In fact, many of his comedies bear a lot of resemblance to contemporary romantic comedies once you get past that initial language barrier. And one of the best examples of how lighthearted and fun Shakespeare can be is Joss Whedon's 2012 adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing. Whether you love him or you hate him, there is no denying that Joss Whedon has a very distinctive style. His dialogue tends to be really fast-paced and quippy, which doesn't always land in his original work, in my opinion, but does an absolutely fantastic job with Shakespeare. Updated from the original play's ambiguously Italian Renaissance setting, Whedon's take on Much Ado About Nothing sets it in contemporary times, filmed entirely in and around Whedon's actual house. The play technically follows a group of rowdy soldiers who return home from the war and stumble into various romantic entanglements. But Whedon's version condenses and recontextualizes the action of the play to focus primarily on the wedding between characters Hero and Claudio. As in the original play, our actual main characters, Beatrice and Benedick, bicker around the edges of the plot while still absolutely stealing the show. Beatrice and Benedick are one of the most iconic Shakespeare couples because their will they won't they banter just feels completely timeless, and they have a really interesting dynamic that holds up really well under modern scrutiny. We know, even though the play was first performed in the year 1600, that Beatrice and Benedick do really like each other, but they're both too proud and stubborn to admit it. And that just feels so wonderfully timeless and fresh, both in the actual text of the play and in Whedon's adaptation of it. Like any good Shakespearean comedy, much of Much Ado About Nothing is centered around miscommunication and trickery, and Whedon's direction really doubles down on the petty, gossipy nature of most of the conflict. This helps the film feel really light and engaging, even when the language can still sometimes be a lot to wade through. If you've never seen a Shakespeare adaptation that you've liked, or you think that they tend to be too fussy, this film is a perfect exception to that, and is just fabulously entertaining the whole way through. You can check out Joss Whedon's Much Ado About Nothing on DVD from the Harris County Public Library. I'm a big fan of modernized Shakespeare adaptations, whether they're just updated setting, like with Joss Whedon's Much Ado About Nothing, or they're full modern alternate universes of the source material, like 10 Things I Hate About You, which is set in an American high school and is a modernized retelling of Taming of the Shrew, told completely in modern language. It is amazing. These tend to primarily affect Shakespeare's comedies, though, probably because the themes tend to be much more universal, but it can work with his tragedies too. And a great example of this is Michael Almereyda's 2000 adaptation of Hamlet, lovingly called by many Hamlet 2000. Almereyda's film places Hamlet in 2000s era Manhattan, with Denmark as a corporation rather than a kingdom. Hamlet is a hipster film student played by Ethan Hawke, and Claudius is a wheeling and dealing businessman played by Kyle MacLachlan. So much of this film is just wonderfully Y2K, and the cast is just absolutely stellar. We've got Julia Stiles as Ophelia, Bill Murray as Polonius, and Liev Schreiber as Laertes. And while it can take a minute to really get settled into this adaptation, a lot of the choices are just really, really fun. Like taking letters that would have been passed between characters in the play and replacing them with faxes, or taking Ophelia's flowers that she carries around with her everywhere and making them into Polaroids. The aesthetic updates are so thorough and the performances are so committed that none of this really manages to be distracting, even though what passed for cutting edge in the year 2000 is pretty outdated by today's standards. The resulting film is a retro-future take on Hamlet's timeless themes of greed and revenge overpowering our basic human decency. And the cold and sterile aesthetics of the turn of the millennium really hammer home just how alien and unnatural this kind of behavior is. Hamlet 2000 hasn't had the staying power of other flashier Shakespeare adaptation films, like Baz Luhrmann's legendary Romeo plus Juliet, but it is a stylish and thoughtful reinterpretation of Hamlet for the modern time, and I absolutely love it. You can check it out on DVD from the Harris County Public Library. On the total opposite end of the spectrum from the low-key modern adaptations of Much Ado About Nothing and Hamlet, we've got The Hollow Crown, the sweeping, historically minded BBC adaptation of the Henriade, which is the series of plays that Shakespeare wrote containing Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, and Henry V. When it comes to Shakespeare's plays, his histories tend to get the short end of the stick. They tend to play things pretty straight, and because they're dealing with real-world events, they can sometimes get bogged down in politics. But The Hollow Crown finds an interesting solution to this issue by essentially filming it as if it was Game of Thrones. This approach actually makes a lot more sense when you think about it. Game of Thrones is actually based on a period of English history that was covered in other Shakespeare plays, namely the ones dealing with the War of the Roses. So the vibes are definitely there. My personal favorite of the Hollow Crown adaptations, and also the one I think is probably the most approachable, is Henry IV Part 1. This play follows Henry, Prince of Wales, who will eventually grow up to be Henry V, as he spends his time drinking and carousing in taverns with his buddy Falstaff, who's a washed-up noble, instead of preparing to take over the throne. Hal, played by the impeccable Tom Hiddleston, has one of the most satisfying character arcs in Shakespeare, in my opinion, as we watch him go from being a hard-partying lad to being a competent military commander, eventually quashing the uprising of the rebel Hotspur. The Hollow Crown adaptation of this story will give you all of the moody, sword-swinging, and medieval debauchery that you're looking for from things like Game of Thrones, but in the addition, you also get Shakespeare's classic writing. If you're interested in Shakespeare, but you're looking for more action and maybe a little bit less romance, Henry IV Part 1 is going to be a perfect choice. You can check it out on DVD from the Harris County Public Library. Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays, but for better or worse, the same ones tend to get adapted over and over. Primarily this applies to his big tragedies, things like Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, and while I do love both of these plays, they have been absolutely adapted to death. One play that has gotten this treatment is Macbeth, but if you're wanting a Macbeth adaptation that is a little bit different than what you might be used to, then I've got just the thing. and that is Akira Kurosawa's 1957 film, Throne of Blood. Throne of Blood is Macbeth in the same way The Lion King is Hamlet. The base plot structure of a low-level knight trying to achieve his destiny to become an aristocrat by any means necessary is still there, but basically everything else is different. The setting has been changed from medieval Scotland to feudal Japan, and although Kurosawa is known as one of the greatest film directors of all time, he was actually a huge lover of theater, and that can really be seen in this movie. In particular, Kurosawa was a well-known lover of no, the traditional Japanese theatrical form, and he brings a lot of no aesthetics into this film, including elaborate costumes, really expressive makeup with white face paint, and kind of choreographed dance-like movement. And although this can be a little alienating at first, particularly to Western audiences who might not be as familiar with no, it really hammers home the uniquely creepy atmosphere of Macbeth, which is definitely one of Shakespeare's spookier plays. As with The Hollow Crown, Throne of Blood is a Shakespeare adaptation that really doesn't shy away from the action, and in particular, Kurosawa's notorious love of very bloody fight scenes. It has had kind of an unusual impact on the film world, like everything Kurosawa ever made, but in particular, Throne of Blood has become deeply beloved by horror fans. And you can see it in kind of some unusual places, like the 1976 horror film Carrie, where a death scene near the end of the movie was inspired by the death scene of Washizu, this film's equivalent to Macbeth. If you're into Shakespeare for the epic storytelling and not necessarily the language, then Throne of Blood absolutely delivers on that and then some. You can check out Throne of Blood on DVD from the Harris County Public Library. Thank you for watching this episode of Screenshots. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter so that you never miss a future episode of Screenshots or any of our other great online programs. I could talk about Shakespeare adaptations all day because there are just a million of them, but be sure to let me know what your favorite is. Everyone has a different opinion on this, and I would be interested to hear. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!